this part of our tutorial, we're going to take an int array and we're going to modify it using a for loop, and we'll use Android to do this. So basically we're just going to initialize an int array and we're going to add 1 to every single element. Now rather than doing that manually, we're just going to get the for loop basically to do our work for us. So we're going to do that by accessing the next element with each iteration and modifying it directly in the loop. So now we've looked at accessing elements within a character array. So we didn't do anything to change them, we just kind of accessed them and converted them to strings and then printed them out. Because if we tried to print each character individually, then it would only really print one at a time on our screen. So that's why we converted them to strings and stuck them together. Now we're going to be looking at integer arrays. So we're going to pass in an array of integers into a for loop, and we are going to add 1 to each element of the array. So the first step will be to create our array. So it's an int array, and we'll just call it int array. And we are going to give it some values. So let's just say 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And remember, we could call the new operator if we want, but we don't have to, so I'm not going to include it. Alright, so do we have an extra? I think we have an extra, yeah, there we go, an extra curly brace, and that's what the problem was. Okay, so now what we're going to do, in fact I want to put it after this text, is we're going to just print out one of the elements just so I can show you a before and after. So this is going to be in Android, so this is text.text, and we're going to say it's equal to int array, and we'll access the fourth element by calling index3, convert it to a string. Okay, so let's just go ahead and run it. We'll run with the Nexus S. We don't want this iPhone up here. Okay, and we get 4 printed out. That's right, because we're accessing the fourth element. Again, index number 3. Now, what we want to do is we want to add 1 to each of these elements now. So let's create our for loop. So we have 4, and then we have our brackets set up. And let's start the indexing at 0 again. Now you can start the indexing wherever you want. It's just convenient for us to start at 0 because we want to include everything in this array. Okay, so if you wanted to access elements in the middle of the array, that's fine. We could start at I equals 2 or I equals 3 or whatever we want. But we want to include everything, so we want to start at the beginning and run until the end. And speaking of running until the end, what if we have the situation where we don't know what the length of the array is? So in this case we know it's 5 because it's up here and easy to see. But what if we had a huge array and we have no idea what the length is? In that case, what we can do is we will call the array int array, and we'll call the length operator. So this just finds the length of your array. This is very handy because in some computer science courses you'll have to feed in a file which is basically just a huge array of characters and you have no idea what the length is. So that's where this length operator is really handy. Okay, and let's finish off the for loop. So we're going to be increasing by 1 each time, and similar to starting at 0, we're usually just increasing by 1, but you can really increase by however much you want. In fact, you can even decrease, but we'll talk about that in later videos. Alright, so we've set up our loop, and now we want to access each element. So again, like we did with the character array, we're going to access the int array of I, and the reason we're doing that is because we want to access each element with each iteration. So when I is 0, we'll access element 0. When I is 1, we'll access element 1, etc. Okay, so this is I, and we're just going to add 1 to it. Alright, so once this loop runs, it should add 1 to every single one of these elements because it will go through each and access the element at the index specified by I with each iteration, and it will just run until it reaches the length of the array. And we saw that this is now 4. Well, it was 4. Now let's see what value it takes on afterwards. So I'm just going to cut it and put it just below the for loop there. So now it should take on the new value of our int array. So we're going to stop this and we're going to rerun it. And here we go, we got 5 printed this time. So we know it was 4 before because it was the third element and has a value 4, but now we've added 1 to each of the elements, so now we know now it becomes 5. So if we were to, let's say, access element 0, do the same thing, and let's see what prints out, and we get 2 being printed out because it started at 1 and now we've added 1 to all of these elements, so now it's become 2. So this is an idea of how you can modify every element in your array. The only problem is that you're restricted to doing the same thing to every single element if you use this loop. So you can write a conditional if you want. You can put if statements within the for loops so that you can kind of modify your values differently, but we'll get into that a little later. But for now, all we can do is perform the same operation over and over again. So although this is a little limited in what we can do, there's still a ton of possibilities, and again, arrays and loops really go hand in hand. In this part of our tutorial, we modified an integer array using a for loop, and we did it in Android. So we called each element at the index specified by the current loop iteration and added 1 to each one. So rather than calling, we had an array of 5 elements, and rather than calling the specific index 5 times, we just called the index of I, and that was the index that that was rather the iteration that the for loop was on. So we only had to make the call once, and we had the loop do the work that we would have otherwise had to do 5 times. So by now, you should be able to perform an operation on every element in an array using a for loop. Again, right now we're restricted to doing the same thing to every element, but later on we're going to look at how we can kind of do different things within the same for loop.